Now some people get confused about deliverables and milestones, but we have two particular elements that we look for when we're carving up the work breakdown structure and we've done some scope management. So in the first place, deliverables are tangible, hold in your hand, verifiable work products, actual things that you can show or demonstrate. And they could be in the form of software, they could be in the form of reports, presentations, they could be in the form of actual prototypes. But you can see them, you can read them, you can understand them. Whereas milestones are less tangible. Milestones are those things you can't necessarily hold them in your hand. They might be, a milestone could be a significant achievement, perhaps the first 100 days of a project, or it could be an acceptance of some deliverables, it could be the end of a phase, it could be a set of work that finally leads to a proof of concept. It could be about having reached a certain level of quality. But milestones are a little bit harder to define than deliverables. And normally, when you look at a Gantt chart and you examine the work breakdown structure, you'll see many, many deliverables and only a few milestones. So understanding how we formulate a work breakdown structure, I guess it's important to get a grasp on. So inputs to the work breakdown structure are first of all in terms of some organisational guidelines. So they're the various policies we might have about how we go about doing things. That helps to shape the way in which deliverables are undertaken. There would have been a preliminary scope statement from our initial project initialisation and our charter documents. And then we'd have a more defined and verified set of scope items as defined in the project scope management plan, and we can add that to the work breakdown structure. And then, as I said, the work breakdown structure is a live document. It changes during the lifetime of the project, and so different changes will happen, and these will get recorded into the WBS, and that will have an impact on things. That triple constraint of time, scope and cost, it will make those things change. Obviously, if we add something to a project, it will add time. It will most likely add cost. If we take something away, it may save time, or it may add in some unforeseen complexities that will that come to bear later down in the project as time passes. So change requests are an important part, and they're important inputs to the work breakdown structure. It's an important point because sometimes people put a work breakdown structure together at the beginning of a project and refuse to add anything to it as the project keeps going. In a systems thinking sense, there are various different approaches to developing a work breakdown structure. There's the analogous approach, where we look at previous projects and we say, well, we did it this way last time, so here are some of the known things that we're going to need this time around. That's one way. Bear in mind when we're looking at that, of course, sometimes an analogous approach, a similar approach, might not be useful, given that when we're talking about projects, often we're talking about something unique and we might want to break free of some of the things we've done before. Another way of looking at things is a top-down approach. This is where we look at the big ticket items and say, okay, well, here are the things that we just absolutely need in this project. They're often much easier to identify than some of the smaller, more complex items that may or may not be in different parts of a project. So top-down approach is good. Another way is to take a bottom-up approach, where you get lots and lots of different inputs from different stakeholders. You really go to town on understanding the whole project, and you try and build up a whole range of different elements. That can be time consuming. It can be patchy too, because some people may be more reliable than others, and the information comes from a lot of different places. So it's important to have an understanding that if you're doing the bottom-up approach for developing a work breakdown structure, that you're meticulous in how you go about approaching all of the various different stakeholders and information holders that can help you to develop those specific deliverables, milestones, and in general inputs. And then one of the other ways of looking at things is by talking about mind mapping. Now, this is an approach that isn't for everyone, but in software development in particular, mind mapping tends to help us to work out how to write tasks in a non-linear form, how to branch in different directions, how to add a certain creativity to the way the work breakdown structure is brought about, and often it can help us to see things in a fresh light rather than the analogous approach, which often means we repeat doing things in a way that we've done many times before. So it can be useful, but it's not for everyone. And then just building on that, of course, so a simple mind map might be one where you've got a general subject, you develop a set of ideas in different directions, and that helps us to spawn different subdivisions or sub-ideas that help map to others. And you can do that many, many times out. It doesn't just have to go to 4 branches of a tree. It can go in various different directions, and they can loop back and crisscross and cross-reference each other. It helps us to be more creative in how we go about the process of deciding the various complexities of an IT solutions-based project. Now, I just mentioned cross-referencing, but of course, when we're creating a work breakdown structure, we don't want 2 different teams to do the same work twice. So a unit of work should appear in only one place in the work breakdown structure. It may have various deliverables, or it may have various different dependencies, or it may be the dependency of something else. However, it should only appear in one place. And the work content of one of these items is the sum of the work breakdown structure items below it. So if you do subdivide a particular heading into different subheadings, it's important that they retain their connectivity with that original work breakdown structure item. Work breakdown structures have to be consistent, reliable in the way in which they document the way work's going to be done. You can't have it done one way and then change tack and do something in a different way, because many, many people will look at this work breakdown structure dictionary, because many people will look at a work breakdown structure. It won't just be a document for one person, it often is a document for dozens and dozens of people within a project team of a complex project. So different project members often have a different way of approaching a work breakdown structure, and so it's important that you get some consistency, and it's important that you try and get everybody to be involved. It's not advisable to have one person within a team working on the work breakdown structure. It should have agreement by as many people within the team as possible. So if you're doing an assignment with 2 or 3 other students and you're working on the work breakdown structure, strongly advisable to get everybody involved at that stage. You can carve it off later, but when you are deriving that scope and you're working out what's in scope and what's not in scope, and you're creating your work breakdown structure, get as many people involved and get as much buy-in as you possibly can. So having said that, it's quite difficult to create a good work breakdown structure. It's quite difficult to seek and to obtain that agreement between different people as to how to organise the work. And a lot of people have different ideas about what comes first, chicken and the egg sort of stuff. However, it's very important to try and find that agreement. Some people get confused about tasks on a work breakdown structure, and they confuse them with specifications or think that they have to be a sequential list of steps. So whilst we might be interested in a simplified format of looking at waterfall style project progression, a work breakdown structure allows for much greater complexity. It allows for different interactions, and it importantly makes a note of the various dependencies. So if something does have a connection with something else, it shows which item should be done first, whether both items can be done at the same time, and which takes precedence, which is dependent on the other. So I mentioned that we do have a thing called a work breakdown structure dictionary, and that it helps us to describe the various WBS tasks. That's it, it's really important. I've got here that sometimes you can write a short paragraph about each work package. Now that might seem silly or frivolous or a waste of time, but it will only be because you have an understanding of what that detail, that particular task entails. But you need to think for others. You need to put in all the information so that other people in the team who may not be as familiar as you are with various elements can look at a work breakdown structure, can look at individual tasks and get an understanding of what each one is going to require. So up until now we've just been assuming that whatever scope we do will be good, but statistically speaking, IT projects have a very poor track record in terms of scope, and poor scope causes project failure. I've got here that without a doubt the most common reason that projects fail is because of poor scope definition. So what that means is that often a project doesn't spend enough time talking to stakeholders, talking to clients and sponsors. And whilst all projects have this difficulty, the people who run IT projects, and perhaps it's something to do with the culture of IT people, sometimes they're not as communicative, sometimes they're not as outward facing as they'd like to be, and IT people often like to convince themselves that they've got an understanding of what stakeholders want, even though they don't spend enough time talking to clients, sponsors and outsiders to find out what the expectations are for a successful project. So it's an ongoing problem, and it requires multiple people to seek to be courageous, I suppose, if that's the right word, but to make an effort to talk to as many stakeholders as possible. And good scope comes about with having the buy-in, if you like, the input of as many people as you possibly can. So just to highlight that issue about expectations, I've got an example here for discussion. So have a think about this. If you're at a company and you've decided that you want to run in-house training for common training needs such as negotiation skills, sometimes the company might say, look, instead of sending the staff off, we're going to do a course that's available on the intranet. And this will be beneficial because people can do it when they have the spare time. It's much cheaper. We don't have to pay to send you away to the eastern states or somewhere. There's much cheaper course fees. We don't have to put you up in a hotel, all those sorts of things. But that can be a problem. The question you have to ask is that meeting the expectations of the company and the firm? Yeah, it might be, but is it also meeting the expectations of the users, and it might not fit both bills? That's what we mean when we're making sure that when we write a work breakdown structure, we think of everybody, think of the problems, think of the deliverables from as many people's points of view as possible. So looking at that example, we might, for example, talk to users who say, look, I think it'd be better if I got away from the job for a few days. I might not like doing online training. It might not be very rewarding or a happy time for me. In this particular example, of course, online training might not be very good for developing interactive skills such as negotiation. You'd want to be talking face to face with people, so that's another area. So management might also be trying to do this just as a cost-cutting measure, and they might have an expectation that somehow by cutting costs they're going to get the same experience as by having people do training face to face. That's why we need to have lots of people consulted when we are trying to work out the scope of a project. If you leave it to one or two people in the team, it will be far worse than if you get everyone involved. One of the other things that we look at in scope is to form what we call a scope baseline. This is effectively a measurement tool. It allows us to work out what our baseline is, our starting point, and so as we are trying to map different change in scope or different things, we can come back to a starting point that makes sense to us. So baselines are very important when we are forming scopes, and it helps us particularly in terms of accounting for money and time. Scope baselines are very important measurements that allow us to work out exactly how much money we need to spend on different deliverables, or at least how much we've allowed for, so we might need to make some change, and they're very useful things for helping us to meet the specific project goals that we've committed ourselves to in a scope statement. Now, I've touched on this before, but understanding the importance of control management, it's really vital. So scope control particularly looks at controlling the changes that happen to the scope. In traditional project management, often the project manager doesn't like to change the scope, or will resist it, or the team will resist changing it wherever possible, because changing scope can be dangerous towards an end time frame or sticking to a budget. That means it can be dangerous for a project manager or his team who's hoping to meet the goals to achieve a certain project bonus. And so they can be hesitant, they can be resistant towards wanting to change. However, if they do need to change, a good project manager will recognise this, but they'll make sure that the changes are signed off and verified. And so having that documented specifically in the scope, not just the scope statement, but in the work breakdown structure is a very important thing. You'll hear the term variance used because variance is the difference between what's initially planned and the actual performance that takes place. And project managers need to be able to demonstrate that if there is a large variance, that they have had sufficient sign-off, that they've had buy-in from the sponsor, that they've taken the correct steps to reduce that variance by as much as possible. Now you're going to hear the term scope creep coming up all the time. Project managers hate scope creep, but scope creep comes about on projects. It's just one of those things that happens, and it happens not necessarily deliberately by someone trying to derail the project, but because people become invested in the project and they think that by adding small nuances, small tiny changes, that A, they're only small so they're okay and they don't necessarily, or they might think that they don't have a great impact, and B, that by adding these small nuances, these small changes, somehow they're adding to the quality of the end product. A project manager will have a different opinion. They'll just see scope creep as something that can derail the project. It increases the risk of project failure. It certainly increases the risk of not finishing on time or on budget, and so that has an effect on bonuses. So you can understand why people like the project manager and his team would be affected. Scope creep can hurt team morale, because often the person who ends up having to undertake to fulfill a new scope creep deliverable feels somewhat disassociated or disenfranchised from their expected deliverables, and they might be asking themselves, well, why have I got to do this? Why is this thing, this looks like scope creep? Now sometimes scope creep can be personal. Sometimes a sponsor, the boss, someone really high up says, no, I just want this to do this little this trivial thing, this something. And we'll feel indebted because even the project manager will say, well, this is the boss, he's the guy that pays all the bills, and sometimes they'll cave in and accept it. A good project manager, a strong project manager, will refute that and say, no, here is what we've got, here's our scope and we're sticking to it. But there are many, many examples of where personal, a sponsor's pet project can mean that certain amounts of scope creep do develop over time. And you'll know from my previous lectures that I dislike projects that become operational too early. Scope creep is a major cause for projects becoming operational, and in trying to incorporate the existing project team whilst the project's effectively finished but is still trying to complete various other elements which we are calling scope creep. So time to turn to my favourite cartoonist, which is Dilbert. Dilbert understands the different things that happen in IT software development, and I think reading the various cartoons often help you to keep a sense of humour in what is otherwise a pretty grim, dark discipline, because project management is either all about the money, and you will have heard me say before, I suppose, project managers can be tough people. They aren't necessarily happy. They have to listen to everyone, but they can often make changes that affect other people within the project team. So when it comes to things like scope creep, often they can be interpreted as one person's personal actions, and other people can be quite hesitant or resistant to want to have anything to do with something which is an unknown. And scope creep often is either at least unknown or otherwise unexpected. The other thing to remember about scope creep, of course, is that when an outsider has an undue amount of influence, that often they'll come up with specific changes that to the general project team will seem to be a little bit out of whack. That is, the general team will have a good handle on things, but an individual or an outsider will come in and make some requests for some changes, and that can breed resentment. So look out for that. It's often a sign that those little changes are in fact scope creep. So having said all of that and trying to convince you that scope creep is a terrible thing and that we don't want to have any of it affecting our projects, it's also in many cases unavoidable. So when scope creep comes about, when you do have something which is, even in a minute sense, changing the scope, it's really important that you document the change. It's really important, no matter how trivial it is, that you put in the various change request forms to make sure that it might not be one big change, but it might be 100 tiny little changes. But if that's enough to shift things so that you don't finish the project on time, it would be really nice to have a change request form so that you can go back to the boss, you can go back to the sponsor, still get paid for having finished your project or your part of the project, and retain rights to a bonus if there's one that's available to be taken. So change requirements can be troublesome, and I suppose it's important then to have a few tricks up your sleeve. One, of course, is to just follow the requirements that are specified. A good scope will allow you to do that. Other things you can do is you can effect some prototyping, modelling that allows people to get an understanding of what's being done, and it also helps us to reduce those sorts of incomplete elements or areas where some change is in the offing. Anytime you want to put a change yourself, or you need to talk about a change, put it in writing, keep it current, make sure people sign off, make sure the communication lines are well and truly open. And then lastly, you need to be prepared to allocate resources for these sorts of changes. It's no good to say, oh, well, look, I haven't got any extra staff, or I can't do this, we'll just have to add it in somehow. That's not good project management. Good project management is about being able to roll with the punches and change things, but also to have some resources set aside so that if need be, you can allocate them at the proper time. So I've mentioned a few times that communications is a difficult thing for people in IT, perhaps more so than other organisational cultures. And so it's really important to make sure that we, wherever possible, we maintain as high a level of user input as possible. So it's more than just simply picking the right people or the right team, because quite often in large complex projects there may be some good people, but it's impossible to expect that everybody's going to be the same level or the same skill, and so there will be some differences. One of the important things to do is to, if you're going to have user input, is to make sure that they have, or at least expect that they have an important role in what they're doing. Don't simply make people token gestures. If you take a stakeholder and you make them suddenly have to do something silly so that you can say, oh yes, they're involved, then you're probably paying them lip service, and that will come back to hurt you, because stakeholders are very, very influential people. Don't underestimate their ability to derail a project management team. Always include them, so when you're holding meetings, have defined agendas, make sure that their elements are on the agenda, and that you get sign off on any specific deliverables, even though you might think that they're minor, because to other users or stakeholders, they'll be key deliverables, and that's how they'll see them, and they'll expect them treated in the same way as your main deliverables, or the ones that you might have thought were more important than others. The other thing is to make sure that you deliver often to your users and sponsors, your stakeholders. Make sure that they are aware of as much as possible of what's going on. The more aware they are, the easier it will be to deal with them on a day-to-day basis. Some people take the opposite view and try and keep stakeholders, users and sponsors in the dark, and that's generally not a good idea, because all projects involve change, and it's very good practice to have people on side when the change comes about. Of course, don't promise to deliver when you know you can't. If it's impossible, if there's a time frame that can't be made, if it's just can't be included in the scope, make sure you communicate that information succinctly, clearly, in writing, and so that there's no argument whatsoever about the fact that you've made it. And tell people in a timely fashion. Don't sit on the bad news for months. Tell people as soon as you know that it could be bad news. And then I've got here, you can co-locate users with developers. It's important to mix it up. You need to get this systems thinking working by getting a lot of different people to think about the scope from different points of view, or often from the same point of view. It's really important to co-locate, to mix, to integrate various different people to help you get the highest quality scope process, the management of that, the picking of the early scope, and the change control of the scope as things go on. So to summarise today, we've looked at this notion of continuing on from an integrated approach to project planning, but we've looked more clearly, I suppose, at project scope planning. We've talked about the importance of a defined scope. We've talked about the creation of a work breakdown structure, the WBS, and the dictionary. We've looked at this issue of scope control, both from the point of view of positive control, but also from the management of scope creep. And we've talked about the inevitability of change control, the fact that projects do have changes that happen, whether we like them or not, whether we plan them in the scope or not, and we have to have the resources available to handle those changes when and if they occur.